the Securities and Exchange Commission. So I'm going to talk about social media in a very general sense, and then touch on some specifics of Facebook. But I wanted to today really try and put social media in context, to think a little bit about why we've developed these products and services, how they fit into the landscape, what the governance model is, because I think there's still a lot of uncertainty about what the governance model is for internet services generally, and then narrow down to some of the challenges that I think social media specifically creates for people working in government. Just in terms of starting off, I wanted to talk a little bit about my personal background, just so you know that how I arrived at this position and the kind of collection of experiences that form these thoughts. I followed a normal career into information technology by becoming an archaeologist. And then having been an archaeologist and dug some stuff up, I got more and more interested in the next bit, which is then recording the archaeological material, using CAD/CAM systems to plot it, and then to kind of share it with the rest of the world. So the National Archives is a nice place for me to be working with. Having been an archaeologist for a little while and then done a master's degree in information technology where I learned modern languages like COBOL, I then applied for jobs, started looking for jobs, and started working in the health service. And the guy who hired me said that was because he'd gone to an agency and said he wanted someone really logical. And so the job agency put logical into their wonderful recruitment systems, and my CV said archaeological. And fell out. And he gave me a job, and off we went. And then I learned even more modern languages like mumps, and short term, which is a wonderful health service language. So having spent a few years grappling with some of the challenges that we had then around moving large patient databases, setting up large patient databases in primary care, something which I know remains a challenge today. I became more and more interested in the policy aspects of that, and then eventually went through a period of working actively in politics, being a practicing politician, never a very expert one, but always a practicing one, and then left to join technology companies, first Cisco and now Facebook. So it's that collection of experiences of working in public sector, working on the government side, and then working, I guess, at what you might call the sharp end of the internet sector right now, that I'm bringing to this discussion. In terms of where social media fits in, I think it is worth just reflecting on history a little bit. Again, not this is an expert audience in terms of technology, but it's worth thinking about the driver that brought us to develop social technologies. And if we think back to the 1950s to the 1970s, we had a period of time when ICT developed, but the only people who could publish were those who had access to significant resources. And the constraints on publishing were that the resources you needed to create databases, to create information systems, in terms of hardware was significant, but also very importantly, spectrum was incredibly limited. So the only people who could publish information to the world were those who could either access radio spectrum, which was very, very constrained in those days. There was no personal radio spectrum, it was all state-owned and then granted to large organizations, or those who could access very, very expensive telecom spectrum, which again was not available to regular citizens. The 1980s, we moved into the era of the personal computer, so people did start having devices, but I remember when I started working in the health service, it was still that time when every computer was individually set up on every desk, and lots of us had a nice job running around with floppy disks, installing software 1 million times on different computers. It was only during the 80s that we started to take those personal computers and then start connecting them up together. And again, networking was incredibly constrained, some by natural forces, some by man-made forces. One of the major constraints was a government mandate that we should not use the evil TCP/IP protocols, but should stick to X25, which is the official authorized protocol for government. So we ended up, with networking and computers still, even in the 80s, not that long ago, being actually quite a constrained resource. The 1990s, I guess, is the time when you could start to think of individual citizens, ordinary people having the power to publish, because we did then start to see personal spectrum. We started to get mobile devices that allowed us to access radio spectrum. We started to see internet access become a mass commodity. And we started to see a broader range of devices coming into the market. So the 1990s was that period where that started to happen. And we started to see personal publishing tools. So we moved from that point of only large organizations being able to express themselves to the world to individuals to a certain degree being able to do that. But the personal publishing tools at that time, things like blogs, you could argue was still really only available to a restricted set of the population. There were people who had quite nerdy technical skills who could do that, and the modes in which you could publish were very limited. It was basically on-off. You could publish to the whole world, or you could not publish, but there wasn't anything in between. And I think that's precisely where, in the 2000s, we started to see then platforms like Facebook and other social media platforms develop to fill a gap which had been developed, a demand that had been built up to say, hang on a minute, this stuff that is available to certain selective tech gurus in society, we want to make it available to everyone. So the simple recipe for social media that I see is there, and the reason it's been so successful is that it has taken this technology and given that voice, that publishing platform, really to everybody. So my mother can use social media in a way that she could never have used a blog or set up a lot of the technology that was there in the 1990s. So the first decade of the 21st century, the revolution we saw was now everybody, pretty much, including my mother, can publish online and get out there and access media broadly. The fact that broadband took off in that period meant that we moved from, again, something quite technical, the old boing-boing of the modem, was fine for tech people, but it was actually quite difficult for other people to grasp. We moved to always-on connections, which are really easy. You don't need to do anything, it just sits there, it does its thing. And the fact that we moved to really simple devices, I think was quite revolutionary. And then we flip forward to 2012, and essentially as I walk around, if I've got one of these devices in my pocket, as most of you do, I have a phenomenal amount of computing power, a phenomenal amount of publishing power, and I can take information and pretty much at will, unless I'm roaming in the European Union, in which case there are some prohibitive factors, but generally if I'm in my domestic market, I can pretty cheaply publish something to the whole world and using these tools that are now available that not only give me simplicity of use, but allow me to exercise a much greater degree of control than before. I've got tools that allow me to publish to specific audiences, to specific communities, and we've moved from the on-off model to something much more complex. And we obviously think that model is pretty much here to stay, that once people have that power to publish personally to the whole world, to engage with the whole world, they're not going to want to give it up. And in the same way that it would be hard to imagine life without mobile phones, we think that if we project forward, it's going to be pretty hard to imagine life without those kind of social technologies, because there is an inherent human desire to connect with people, to communicate with people. And there may be other tools and products and services, and my disclaimer kicks in again here, I don't know what those tools and products and services will be. There may be other tools and products and services, but they will share those common features, that they will be about publication of personal information, sharing of something that you have found, that you've experienced, whether that's a piece of music, or a piece of film, or a piece of government information, or a health condition that you have. You'll want to share that with a defined community of people. You'll want to do it instantly, you'll want to do it wherever you are, and you will have the tools available to allow you to do that. So social media has created, I think, a revolution in terms of personal publishing, the ability to share things with other people that now is available to everyone rather than to a narrow set of society, in a way that does challenge the traditional control that large organizations had, whether those were media organizations or those who produce copyrighted content, or whether those were government organizations, that they used to have quite a narrow funnel for getting information out to people, and now that funnel is much, much broader. And that does raise challenges or questions around governance. And I think there was a traditional view, some people in the internet community fed this view, that I always thought was really unhelpful when I moved to being on the policymaker side. People in the internet community would kind of say, the internet is too complicated, no one can govern it. And a myth sort of fed by that grew up to say the internet is an ungoverned space, these services are somehow ungoverned. I actually think that fundamentally misses the point. If you work within an internet company, you don't feel ungoverned. You don't feel like you're in a lawless space. You have a huge number of very specific and very defined responsibilities. I think what's different is that the spaces exist both associated with a particular geographical jurisdiction and as virtual spaces that are accessible from anywhere. And the model I've come up with, I think, is easiest to grasp in terms of describing this, is that internet services like ours are pretty much like offshore islands. A lot of them are offshore islands of the United States, of California in particular, because that's where they're developed. But there can be offshore islands of anywhere. There are offshore islands of China, local Chinese services. There are offshore islands of the United Kingdom, services developed and built in the United Kingdom. But by offshore island, I mean, they are spaces that seem to have their own rules, but ultimately they're subject to the home jurisdiction. As Facebook, ultimately, whatever goes in the United States law, whatever control the United States authorities want to exert over us, they're able to do so in the same way that they can for any other corporation or entity that belongs to the United States. And we've created sort of situations in other places that have other liabilities, particularly in the context of Europe. We have a very large international headquarters operation in Dublin that provides services to countries including the United Kingdom. And again, they're absolutely subject to Irish law. There's no question that they somehow exist outside the legal framework. So we do exist within the legal framework. We are, like I said, an offshore island that has both a statutory jurisdiction and then typically a set of rules that lay on top of that. In Facebook's terms, we have a set of policies which actually we can pull together in a page which I think is at facebook.com/policies. And that tells you, for example, our community standards. Those are standards that we apply to content on the site, which are not independent of criminal law, but build on top of criminal law and apply other particular restrictions that we choose to place on the site that are in addition to the local criminal jurisdiction. In terms of the way that governments in other countries can react to these offshore islands, again, to stretch the analogy, I think they broadly have three choices. The first is to say, we will not let our citizens go to that place. You know, that place is so outrageous and so beyond what we want to see that they simply can't go to that island at all. And that happens. People block internet services in some countries around the world precisely on that basis. They see the island as inappropriate for their citizens to visit. And that is actually typically a reaction of governments to a whole range of different issues. Their first thought is, let's stop the people going there. Let's effectively withdraw any ability to get a visa to visit that island, and let's use our local internet service providers to do that. The second model is to say, well, the regime in that island is close enough to our regime, and therefore we'll just let our citizens go there freely. They can go, they can do what they like, we're not going to try and control them in any way when they go and visit that space, because the controls that are already in place are sufficient, equivalent to the kind of controls we might put in place locally. They may not be exactly the same. There may be differences. We may have a legal prohibition on Nazi content because we have a particular history and heritage, and these guys may not have a prohibition on Nazi content on their island, but hey, it's okay. We're not going to quibble over that, as long as the big stuff, like child abuse, like serious criminal offences is dealt with, we're not going to quibble about stuff at the edges. And that's pretty much how a lot of internet services work when they start off. They open up, they connect to the whole world, and most countries don't have an issue with their citizens going and spending time on those services. As services get bigger, though, there's a third phenomenon that often kicks in, which is to say, okay, my citizens can go to the island, but I want the island to kind of create separate spaces that do reflect my local particular jurisdiction. And so I'm going to start making demands on the service. I'm going to start saying, look, if a citizen of Germany goes to that space, I do actually want you to make sure they don't see Nazi symbols. Okay, for citizens of the rest of the world, but please make sure that they're not exposed to Germans. And that's pretty much, I think, where we are in terms of the status quo with a lot of the services today. And they do that through two methods. They either do it by giving people different landing stages. So if you look at a company like Google, I think Yahoo do something similar. They have a .uk version, a .de version, a .fr version, and they say, depending on how you landed on the island, we'll give you different content. We'll respect local law according to how you landed. Now, they don't actually know where you're coming from. It's not relevant, really. If you come through the .com, the US landing stage, then you'll get the US content. If you come through the UK one, you'll get the UK content. So they're really saying to the user, you indicate which view of the island, which space you want to go into. Or the other version, which is what something like Facebook does, because we don't have those separate domains, we have a single global community. The way that we deal with it is to say we'll actually check where you came from as best we can by reading your IP address and understanding where you came from, and then we may adjust the content accordingly. I think Twitter recently started doing similar practice as well. So we're a government space. It's slightly, a sort of messy governance model. It has a home jurisdiction, and then it has some respect for and different measures to accommodate other jurisdictions around the world. And I think there are some other characteristics of the space that think about the challenges that this represents for government, and particularly think about information risk. I think the challenges then come into a number of different areas. Firstly, there is this notion that you're entering into a space where the rules are not yours. Neither the formal legal rules, in most cases, are entirely yours, nor the rules of behaviour in that space. And so you do have a comparable set of decisions to make if you are allowing people to engage in that space. Do you block access to it? Again, a very typical response in government, in fact in education, a number of areas, is to say, look, I feel so uncomfortable that I can't set the rules for that space. I'm going to simply tell people not to go there, in terms of their professional capacity or within that educational establishment. You could try and change the rules of that space, but that's very difficult and challenging, and the spaces that we operate, we typically don't want to change our rules simply because governments ask us to do so, although we may make some reasonable accommodations. But the relationship is not a simple one, not a typical one for government of being able to simply say, hey, change the rules, otherwise we won't use you. The response from many internet companies is, don't use us then. It's not a classic response of government to supplier, where the government is able to dictate terms to the supplier. And the other option is to accept the rules and work with the rules and try and frame a response that allows you to work with the rules and not try too hard to adjust them. I'm going to talk probably about that latter area. I think that's where most of the companies will come from, is to say that that's the most realistic option. These services exist, they're going to continue to exist, they're going to continue to be very important in the lives of the citizens the government is dealing with. I think we're over, we mentioned Twitter at 10 million users, we're over 30 million, of whom more than half are on the service every single day. So our daily reach is in the sort of 15 to 20 million range. Those people typically are using it on mobile now in increasing numbers, so there is that constant connectivity. It is, we have one of those spaces where people are primarily searching for, looking for information, engaging with people online. And so with that reality, I think there is a need to think about how that engagement is going to happen. And there are some characteristics of the space which I think are particularly challenging for government and that we need to think about. I think the first, in terms of the norms that we set out, is that the platforms are designed for sharing. And this is, we get a lot of criticism from people saying, well, how come everything isn't more private? Well, because it's not designed that way. If I take a photo, it's never designed that way. It's not what the platform for. On the front page it says this platform is for you to connect and share with people. If I take a photo and I want to keep it private, then keep it on the phone. And if I want to show it to people, I can take it around the room and show it to them. As soon as I upload it online, I'm sending a signal to say I want to share it with someone. And so the tools we're developing allow you to control the audience you're sharing with, but we're not designing for people to put things on the service and then not share them. It just isn't any point. Keep it on your own device if you don't want to share it. And I think that's sometimes a kind of fundamental misunderstanding, where a challenge to us is to say, why don't you lock all this stuff down? And I say the simple answer is that's not what the platform's for. Other platforms are locking things down. Social media are for sharing, and always will be designed in that way. Powerful sharing, granular sharing, and sharing nevertheless. So that sharing notion, I think, is a challenge, and it's a challenge in environments where typically much higher degrees of control have had to be exercised over sharing. And that would be the first question I would ask is, when dealing with social media, is it a piece of information that you feel comfortable being shared? Do you feel comfortable with the fact that that sharing will be out of your control once it's put onto the platform? And I think there are plenty of use cases where that is appropriate, and there are plenty of use cases where it's not. So obviously in government terms, typically anything related to personal data, sensitive personal data, may be inappropriate. But there are other use cases, and you can stretch it quite far where it may be entirely appropriate. I mean, health data is a hugely sensitive area, and I know people have expressed concerns about things like whether NHS choices should allow social media sharing, because someone may be looking up something about a particularly sensitive condition and then they share it through social media. Understanding those concerns, we still need to look at the behaviour of people on these spaces that already happens. And so there are web services like Patients Like Me, where people will go and share information about their conditions with other sufferers of the condition, really very openly, in order collectively to exchange those views. People will come to web services like ours and share information which, all of the rules would say is completely inappropriate, but they feel comfortable doing that. So there may be plenty of use cases where individuals, where the public, if you like, is ahead of the way in which we've traditionally thought, because they're sharing information which we would normally tell them is inappropriate, but they're finding ways to do that. And we've dealt with a number of organisations. We have relationship with organisations like the Samaritans to make sure that if someone publishes some suicidal content, we can try and connect them with the help that they need. And one of the challenges that organisations like that have found is that people will come to their pages on social media and talk about things which, in their terms, are completely inappropriate. And the question is, how do we then divert them to spaces where it's more appropriate? So sharing, I say, is at the heart of it. And I think the most powerful cases will be those, or use cases will be those, where you expressly want the sharing, where you want the old word used to be virality, which I hate. Things going viral is not good. Particularly health data going viral is never good. So I prefer the word organic. When you want organic sharing to take place, and that's where it really comes into its own. And I think that's where the open data initiatives are particularly relevant, where you are thinking, look, we've got some data, we're very comfortable with it being shared. Our problem is not that it's not got too wide an audience, our problem is that this data hasn't got a sufficiently wide audience. We would love more people to know about schools performance data or environmental performance data or something like that. At the moment it's locked up in websites that frankly very few people visit. How do we get it out to a bigger audience? So sharing is a challenge but also a tremendous opportunity. The other really big challenge, I think it's particularly true in government, is around authenticity. And we have explicit rules on our platform, it's not true for all platforms, that people must operate in their authentic identity. And the reason for that is really quite straightforward, that if you are sharing stuff with people, you want to know to a reasonable degree of certainty that the people you're sharing with are who they say they are. And there are plenty of other platforms where people can be whatever they want to be. They can be Mickey Mouse 123 or anything else, and there's a place for those spaces. But we found that, again, for a lot of the kind of people who were previously intimidated by technology, by internet technology, they found that this environment where they have this reasonable degree of certainty that people are who they say they are is a much more conducive environment. They feel much more comfortable within it. And you can see by the user numbers the degree to which that has appealed to people. It does create some huge challenges for the public sector in particular because we don't make exceptions. And so our view is that somebody should be operating in their authentic identity, whether they're doing that as a public servant or whether they're doing that as a private individual. And so we do have questions that are raised with us on a frequent basis. You can imagine for law enforcement in particular, they'll say, can't I just go on as Monsieur, actually it's French law enforcement, I have a Monsieur Michel that I sometimes deal with, and Monsieur Michel would like to go on as Monsieur Michel, and I know that's not his real name, and if he goes on as Monsieur Michel, then we will take him off the platform because he must operate under his authentic identity. So that's, I guess, at the sharpest end of things is when dealing with sensitive areas like law enforcement, but it runs across the piece. We would not, on our platform, be comfortable with somebody who wants to operate and offer advice on any kind of public service doing that in what we would call a fake identity. And so there's some challenges, I think there. And the third area of particular challenge that we have is around the control of conversations. So again, one of the areas I've spent quite a lot of time looking at was how government can create spaces in which it engages with people to discuss policy issues and so on. The challenge there is that if you create a government space that's very, very safe and very controlled, you'll typically want to moderate everything. You'll want to make sure, because it is a government space, it's on a .gov.uk domain, that it's not too sweary. But unfortunately, people aren't like that. People get irate, they get off topic, they get sweary, and on social media sites, of course, they can do that. But the challenge, I think, for government is again, how does it navigate that? Does it create a safe, sanitized space? So I'm prejudiced here, a safe, sanitized space that no one wants to use, or does it engage in the slightly messy, rough space where it's probably going to get more feedback, more engagement, but it's not able to set the rules of the game? And to what extent does government take the blame for the sweary, rough behaviour, particularly when scrutinised, perhaps by some of the more popular media outlets? So understanding those rules of engagement and developing rules that say we're engaging, but we're not responsible for the behaviour of these people is really, I think, a major challenge to overcome. In terms of being able to do that, I think there is quite a lot of protection offered by the beta model, which a lot of us in ICT absolutely love, and the internet space, that one is doing things to test things out, which is really kite flying. Let's go out, let's beta test government consultation using these messy social media spaces. And if nobody notices, we'll say that that's now mainstream. If people notice and get upset, we'll say it was just a beta program and we've cancelled it. But beta can be incredibly helpful, I think, in this space. And then that's the final area that I think is really tricky, is that the spaces you're dealing with, including our space, don't neatly divide content from commercials, don't neatly divide commercial activity from, if you like, public service activity. And so we have a model of television that we all understand, and on television we have a lot of regulation around this, in fact across the media generally, that look, here is the content and here is the commercial stuff, and we can regulate it, we can talk about so many minutes per hour, or we can talk about standards and so on. The internet just kind of throws that all up in the air. And that's not just us, that's, if you run a blog, are you a newspaper or not a newspaper? You run a blog and you stick on some, Google ads or whatever they are onto the side of your blog. Are you now a commercial entity? Aren't you a commercial entity? You stick a video on your blog. Are you now a regulated audio-visual media services provider or not? People who build this stuff don't think about this. They just build it, they get it out there, they stick the ads on, they monetize it. It all gets kind of jumbled up. And regulators are looking at this, and there's a rationale for regulators looking at this from a consumer protection point of view. But I don't think it's likely to change. If anything, it's likely to get messier rather than less messy, because people are just, in our space, constantly innovating and trying new models. So again, for government, I can see there is a challenge of, is one engaging in a public service communication model, is one engaging in a quasi-commercial activity? And the answer in many cases is going to be that it's quite hard to define. It's quite hard to put things into a pure public service and non-commercial box. So we're not making life easy for you. So I think I'm going to stop in a couple of minutes and think about any questions that you have around social media generally, or Facebook in particular. But as I said, just really to summarize, try and set things in that context, that what we have today is a citizenry in the United Kingdom that is empowered, that's able to publish anytime, anywhere, that may publish more sensitive information or different kinds of information, or behave in ways which are well outside the framework of traditional government communication. And I don't think they're going to stop doing that. That's the natural platforms that they now have. That I think there is a huge potential for government to engage through these platforms, but we shouldn't underestimate the challenges. And I think these challenges are in particular around thinking very hard about what information wants to be shared and what wants to be kept secret, and understanding the power of sharing for the information that wants to get out there, but understanding the challenges of trying to keep secret the information that you don't want to get out there. Thinking about these issues around identity, how one presents oneself online, and models for doing that. And I think if there is new guidance for civil servants around using social media, that will be incredibly helpful in terms of setting the benchmark for people as to how they should present themselves. And then thinking about how comfortable one is to operate in spaces where, say, you don't and won't fully control the rules for the way in which people can behave and express themselves, and where you don't and won't be able to fully control the rules for the way in which those platforms develop commercial activity, perhaps around content that has come from government. And I'll stop there, I think.